The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.
Welcome again to another video of a Randall Lewis seminar. Last night, Thursday, November 17th, we had really an exceptional seminar and it was framed with this question, responding to California's major fire challenges, how communities plan and operate under the Master Mutual Aid System. A kind of long way of saying is, how does this happen? You and I see on television fires and emergencies. We see command centers, we see fire trucks, we see helicopters and planes. But the question that resulted in the seminar, how does this happen? How do all these things that we see and depend upon and look to? And it is one of the major success stories of coordination. And so I'm really excited to introduce to you our guest, Mike Esparza. Began as a firefighter in the city of Riverside, and then retired as interim fire chief. Mike, you were also involved, not simply what happened in the city, but you were served on a variety of state boards over time, right, during your service?
Yes, Ron, I was very fortunate. I spent 20 years on the California State Board of Fire Services, and it's a governor appointee position. I've served with 16 other members there, and there we worked on making training standards for the fire service. We also reviewed fire prevention laws and various things. So it was quite an honor. I've served every governor since Wilson, actually.
So you saw fire service from a state perspective.
Yes, and what was really nice for me is that I got to work with folks that were the kind of the mover and shakers of the fire service in California. And it's a very broad board because it includes the insurance industry, it includes a government official, it includes labor, in terms of fire service labor, volunteers, fire chiefs. Is really a wide spectrum of people on this group.
So it's not all firefighters?
No, it's not. So it was a very good experience for me. And after my 20 years serving on the state board, I was appointed to the Fire Scope Board, which is the board that I'm on now.
What is the Fire Scope Board?
Well, the Fire Scope Board mostly consists of folks that are just in the fire service, leaders in the fire service. And this board actually started due to the major fires that happened in Southern California.
What's the mission of the fire service? What's fire service about?
Well, certainly the fire service is, the purpose is to put out fires. If you look at the mission statements of almost every fire department in the United States, you'll see that our purpose or our mission is to protect life, property, and the environment. And with that is sort of a wide umbrella of things that we do. We respond to medical emergencies, rescues, hazardous material incidents, and of course fires.
And there's a whole variety of natural emergencies that you respond to.
Well, most definitely. You know, we can have flooding. In some cases, lightning starts fires. And then, of course, there's the man-made type of emergencies. We have terrorism that we deal with now and other complexities that we didn't have to deal with many, many years ago. I responded to the 9/11 incident as part of our urban search and rescue team in the city of Riverside Fire Department. And in that response, I was a communications specialist, so I played a role in the team that responded there.
How did you do that by being in Riverside?
Well, years prior, we had an opportunity to participate in a brand new program, a nationwide program called the Urban Search and Rescue Program. It was sponsored by FEMA and also California Office of Emergency Services. When we looked at that, we realized that in Riverside, though we had some training and some ability to respond to earthquakes and other disasters in our city, in reality we were limited. We didn't have the training and equipment. And by participating in this program, we were going to receive a huge grant that would allow us to train our folks on how to respond to those things. In addition, we were going to get $1 million worth or so of equipment. So fortunately, the fire chief, the city manager, and the council looked at this issue and allowed us to get into the program.
If we were back in the 19th century, what kind of fire service would we discover?
Well, let me take you a little bit back to 1736. Most people don't know this, but Ben Franklin is considered the father of the modern fire service. Prior to his efforts, the fire service was solely focused on self-help. If you had a fire in your house or your business, you had to take care of yourself. Maybe the community would come in with fire buckets. You see on this slide here, we have some buckets filled with water and throw it at the water.
I mean, you see in movies, you see it's one of the funny things you see, right? Is these long lines of people, each passing buckets on to toss on a fire. With what effect? Pretty modest effect, right?
So you're right, Ron, that the community would take these buckets and they would throw water on the fire, but honestly, they weren't very effective. Interestingly, the community started forming fire clubs, if you will, to work on fire issues, putting out fires in the community, but they were only focused on protecting the people who were part of their club. Insurance companies also formed these clubs, but they were only worried about protecting the folks that they were insuring. If you see in this slide here, you see some plaques on the bottom called fire marks. Businesses or houses, they would put the fire mark in front of their house, and when there was a fire, and these clubs would come and respond to these fires, and if you didn't have their mark, they wouldn't put out the fire. This is where Ben Franklin comes in. He realizes the need to provide fire protection for the whole community, no matter whether they can afford fire insurance or not. So he formed the Union Fire Brigade, as I recall.
So in the beginning, these are really kind of you call them clubs, but they were private. They were private rather than public, essentially fire service.
Yes, and typical of probably a lot of disasters, it's in the fire service, it's kind of the same way. When you have a really bad incident, if you have a local disaster, then you really get the attention of the public and other people, and they start addressing those needs. And that's exactly what Ben Franklin did. They had a devastating fire in Philadelphia, and he was successful at forming this team.
So we initially did not have fire services as we recognize now, and so tell us a little bit about this transition. How do we move from this sort of whether insurance companies or by clubs and private? How do we move from that kind of service to where there's now much more of a public service?
Well, we see kind of an evolution in the fire service, if you will, and so as the need becomes more and more apparent that we need to organize in the United States during the Industrial Revolution, we see a rapid growth of buildings, populations moving into the city, and there's not a lot of there's not of attention being paid to fire prevention issues. Consequently, we have devastating fires.
Like the big one they had in Chicago that they always talk about.
Exactly, as an example. So it became very apparent to leadership in the communities and government that they needed to form a full-time professional fire service. And that's where you see these fire brigades, if you will, or these fire clubs turning into volunteer fire departments and then eventually becoming paid fire departments and providing the service to the communities as we do now.
Why is it important to show up on a timely way at a fire?
Well, fires, I like to use this rule of thumb. It's not very scientific, but I like to say fire doubles every minute. So fire essentially just exponentially increases. And so it's our desire to try to get to a fire within 5 minutes of it being reported. The reason for that is as fire continues to grow, all the elements that are in a structure, in a house, heat up. Temperatures up to the roof exceed 1,000 degrees. So now you have all these elements in the house that are essentially emitting fumes that are just waiting to catch fire. And when it gets to a certain point, ignition point, it all explodes in fire. We have a flashover. So it's our desire to get to a house, let's say, and get there before that happens. So if there's anybody overcome by smoke, we can rescue them before that happens.
Part of the reason for this seminar was not so much what good work is done within cities or within fire districts, but how, when there are these major fires or major emergencies, one, it's the scale of them, that this is not simply a single house burning or an accident. Tell us a little bit about I mean, when you start talking about major fires, the scale of these.
Well, I'd like to point out the short video clip we have here regarding a fire that happened in the 60s, the early 60s. In this video, it really it's a news clip from the early 60s, and it talks about the devastation. It actually shows some of the houses burning. You'll see some of the firefighters not wearing any safety gear that we're used to now, doing their best to save the homes and the people in that area. But it was a much different environment then, and I like talking about this because while the fires haven't changed, the complexity has. So what have we done in the California Fire Service to be able to protect our state in a better way?
The worst fire in Southern California history rages through the foothills in the Bel Air and Brentwood districts of Los Angeles County. The blaze raced with incredible swiftness through the brush-choked canyons of the Santa Monica Mountains, and before it was contained, it had destroyed more than 450 homes. 14,000 acres are burned out, and damage is roughly estimated at upwards of $20 million. Squadrons of planes drop tons of a fire-retarding borate solution as the battle to check the fire goes on for days. The area is suffering its third straight year of drought, and the trees and brush were tinder ready for any spark to set off the conflagration.
I want to share that really the science of fire really hasn't changed. It's still as powerful and devastating. It's still, the devastation really is still based on the fuel, the weather, and topography. What has changed over time has been the complexity. We have people that have bought homes or built homes in the hillsides and the mountains and so forth. And so as we see the change in our communities, we see how these fires now burning many times in the same places they did in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And
there are more people and more building, more structures there.
Yes, and so that becomes quite devastating.
Well, before that, you mentioned we get this, what's the focus here? How do you put this kind of cooperative effort together? You were suggesting, for example, you have hoses that wouldn't work together. They had radios that you couldn't talk to each other. Can you just comment on that, which was true, I guess, in the middle part of the 20th century?
In the 60s, you start seeing fire departments get two-way radios, and they're on the fire engine. They don't have radios they can carry with them, and if they do have them, they're big. So we have an improvement in communications within their fire department, but when you have a devastating fire and you have to call for assistance from other agencies, they have a different radio system, and there's no way to communicate and coordinate these fires. So it became very difficult to fight these fires. Sometimes you had duplicated efforts at these fires. Sometimes you had areas of the fires that weren't even attended to because of miscommunications. But after 1970, then Governor Reagan, started a task force called Fire Scope. And this group consisted of membership of the Fire Service, League of Cities, and various other groups, where they talked about this problem. And they decided that we needed to modernize and come up with better ways of protecting the folks that lived in California from the devastation of fires. Because of this group, Fire Scope, we were able to start focusing on the needs that we have to better provide those services and to help minimize the damages from these devastating fires. We focused on, which became the Instant Command System, and a multi-agency coordinating system. So the Instant Command System is essentially was invented by the Fire Service in the 70s. And what it is just it's a management system. It's utilizing management by objectives. It takes into account that that not one fire agency can take care of all emergencies by themselves. So how do we integrate? So we had to start coming up with common terminology, common way of managing a fire. When there's multi-agencies involved, because a fire doesn't stop at a city border, we started learning that we need to come up with a unified command. We needed to work together with common goals to successfully mitigate the emergency.
Let's take the Cajon fire. How does this instant command and the resources begin to come together and focus on these major fires?
Every agency has their own response protocol. So depending on the emergency and the sound of the emergency in terms of what the information we get will dictate the initial response. And the beauty of the instant command system is when someone gets there and they take charge of the incident, they evaluate what they have and where we think this incident's going to go. How big is it going to be? So we grow the incident using this management system. When it gets very large, typically over 24 hours, it's very important that we order well-trained folks to manage certain aspects of that fire, key aspects. We generally see on TV the operations chief running the troops, but there's more to that in the background. We bring in a finance officer who runs all the finances, that deals with costs, purchasing items that we need for the fire, workers' comp issues. We have logistics experts that come in and they're in charge of making sure that camp is set up, that we feed the folks when they need to be fed. They order and provide fuel for our fire engines. I already shared with you operations. They're essentially running the fire and making sure the troops are operating cohesively and safely. And then we have a planning component, and the planning folks, they're planning ahead. Where's this fire going? What are our needs?
They're all in the same room?
They're all in the same area.
Same area.
So the larger the fire, the more complex the fire, the more staffing that's going to be given to these folks.
One of the things you showed up in last night, you had this wonderful chart of the resources of the state, and maybe you want to just identify what that, which again emphasizes the importance of this sort of shared responsibility that now exists.
In 1993, at the Topanga fire, the old Topanga fire, we were able to get 180 strike teams committed to the incident within 24 hours.
Strike team is
5 engines and a leader. Each fire engine has 3 or 4 firefighters on there. So we amassed this massive bit of mutual aid. So every fire agency every morning takes an inventory of what and who they have on duty and what they're able to offer to the mutual aid system. Additionally, in the city of Riverside, as an example, we have 2 fire engines that belong to the Governor's Office Emergency Services. They're not staffed, but they're cross-staffed. So in the event that there is an emergency in the state, we can take on-duty staff and put it on those engines and send them.
So there's 2 state engines in the city of Riverside?
In the city of Riverside proper. So if you look at this, the state of California, OES specifically, has offered, and now you see a slide here, we have over 114 fire engines strategically located throughout the state, as well as other type of engines, 15 or more wildland fire engines, 4-wheel drive engines that are able to go and fight wildland fires specifically. So we have all these resources strategically located. What's kind of interesting is that about half of the fire service is off duty at any given time in a 24-hour period. So much like the reserve in the military, we have a reserve that we can actually draw from and bring them into the fire department and staff engines that are on standby, if you will, and respond statewide to any emergencies. So these are the state resources you see on this slide. But if you look at this next slide, it kind of demonstrates really the kind of resources that's throughout California. We have about 3,500 structure fire engines staffed every day throughout California. This includes volunteer and paid fire departments. We have various other fire engines. So we have almost 6,000 in total fire engines throughout the state of California, various types, off-road, wildland, structure engines. And we have the ability in the state to amass between 200 and 250 strike teams in a sense, at a given moment. There certainly is a process for it, but we have a lot of resources available to help Californians.
Who's deciding what cities respond and how you put these different strike teams together? Is there some separate place that this is happening?
Well, as an example, each agency, each fire chief talks to their neighboring chiefs, and we have either written or verbal agreements on helping each other. But it goes beyond that. The day-to-day we can ask. It's I like to call it neighbors helping neighbors. Certainly, I need help today, they may need help tomorrow, kind of a thing. But then from there, it gets more formalized. If we have an incident that's particularly devastating, maybe it's going to last several days, which we call operational periods. There's a built-in system that we can access help, and it starts from, for instance, the city of Riverside asking the neighbors. They help to their ability. If they're not able to fulfill all the needs of the city of Riverside, we go throughout the county to get resources, and the county agencies, city and county, helps. And if they're not able to provide all the resources that are needed, then we go to a region. In this particular slide, you can see that there's regions. So, as I shared with you, there's individual fire agencies in a county. A county is called an operational area. There's a fire chief that's selected amongst all the chiefs in that county to operate as a coordinator for that county. And we pre-approve in the morning what's available to help our neighbors. And then we expand out to the region, and then the region helps us. And then when that region is depleted, then we go to the next region. And then when that's depleted, then we'll go to the state. And then the state will help move resources up and down the state.
You began to say, and on top of all this, I have to understand what weather is about. Do you have GPS kind of? Talk a little bit about where the sort of latest kind of tools that the fire services is using.
From the original goals, over time, the fire service has just built on these concepts and the needs that we had. And in order to be more efficient and effective, we have to take advantage of the most modern tools that we have. Fire weather is a significant factor to us, and it's important in the fire service that we understand what's expected. It's amazing to me that in the morning I get briefed at a fire, and a weather expert will tell me about 3 o'clock the weather is going to change and it's going to look like this. You have to be on alert for this because the fire is now going to burn downhill instead of uphill like we've been experiencing. And usually within 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, that's exactly what happens. And so why is that important? It's important for firefighter safety, but it's also important for the community because the fire is going to change direction. So as time has gone on from the 70s on to current modern times, our ability to get that information quicker, sooner is so important. We have a program that we use now that's an emerging program and is just starting to get adopted by the fire service called SCOUT. It stands for Situational Awareness and Collaboration Tool. And in this program, we're able to dial up real-time weather, topography maps. We're able to see the communities that are at risk. We're able to draw on this map an area to find out census data so we know how many people are at risk and where the fire is going and how many people we need to move out of the area. This particular slide actually shows where fire stations are, where city boundaries are, where parks are, where hospitals are. If we were to need to evacuate a lot of people, we want to know where the parks are, where we can take these folks. If we need to set up a command center, we need a large area, we can go to certain parks. So this tool here is really cutting edge. The other thing that it does is it gives us the ability to track where our fire engines are.
How do you know where they are or where they're coming?
Well, historically, say in the 80s when I was sent to a fire in Northern California, we get the call, we gear up, we leave, and we go, and then we don't hear from anybody until we get there. And when we get there, after 10 hours of drive, we find out that they had canceled us 6 hours earlier. So you see that system isn't very efficient. Yeah. Certainly with radio communication that has improved over the years, but now with tracking and cell phones, if we send somebody to a fire and they have to drive for 10 hours and we want to cancel them or send them to another emerging fire somewhere else, we can actually see which strike teams are the closest to the new fire and we can divert them there. So it's real-time movement of our folks. It's also real-time safety for our firefighters because the incident commander can actually see where they are in this devastating fire and move them out of the bad areas and direct them to good areas that are safe and an area where we can fight and protect the community.
Next time when there's a major fire and a major response, begin to understand a little bit how all this happens, and which is the purpose of the seminar, the purpose of the video. But Mike, thanks very much.
It's a pleasure spending time with you, Ron.
The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.